All right, in the last video we just showed everybody the application. We kind of went through it pretty quick, but you could see from it that it was a application for managing a business's process in a company that's been live about a little over a month, 6 weeks almost. In this video, what I'm going to do is kind of show the top level view on the development side of the tooling that we used to get that done. That application is about total 230,000 lines of code probably. Last check, I guess. 99% of it is probably all generated, and that's just through what we're going to show in these next couple of videos. And the first one here is this is OABuilder, which is a modeling tool. It lets you model out your, it's more than a data model, but it's not quite a UML model. It's an object relational model, along with capabilities for defining things that support MVC, model-driven architecture type. So that last application is called CDI, and we're going to bring that up, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. And basically, this is very similar to working with a entity relationship diagram, that's basically describing what your database looks like. In this case, if we relate to the last, the demo application, we have sales orders, we have customers, information about those. In this case, most of this data is also represents what it looks like in the database. Some of it's not. So basically gives you the functionality of a relational model, on top of that a object model, and then along with that metadata. So from this, if we just look at the sales order itself, we can see its connections to its other information. We can look at something like a price code, so we know that a sales order has a price code. And again, for this application, all these are just objects. And this is basically saying a sales order has a price code. A price code itself for this application determines what the sales price is going to be based on, like a markup charge and stuff like that. If we go into any of this, it basically allows us to define, we can, as we're creating this, we define it, but for the most part, it pretty much defaults pretty close to what we want it. So we give it a name and it starts filling stuff out for us. And again, on a larger screen, you get a better view on all this, but I'll try to keep this at a good resolution for video. So as you describe the object, then its properties, and then what's called calculations. One of the things about all these objects when they're going to be created and used in the application, back to the MVC, it also has what's called object or observable object model, and sometimes it's also called a reactive object model. And within that, you can define calculations, and calculations can actually be kept up to date real time, just like in a spreadsheet. If you have a formula that's based on cells, and it automatically gets calculated based on any changes or anything that happens within the system. So within a model like this, we could go ahead and use that capability as we go in and create our calculations, and we can go ahead and actually put the data properties that are used for that calculation. And part of what that will do is within the system, whenever one of those changes, it's kind of listening to it, is it will automatically recalculate it, run the formula. It's smart enough to know how to do it and what thread and stuff like that. There's a lot of concurrency type stuff going on. The actual calculation itself is embedded into the model or stored in the model. And then any custom methods that you want to add within the objects, you can, as you're defining these or adding things, there's automatically UI information that's also added into it and can be customized, and how it relates to the other objects within the model. The links are the relationships between the objects. So we were talking about the sales order and the price code and the price code itself. So there's a relationship there. Again, in most cases, it stays pretty much the default, but you can really fine tune it. You can give it very specific ways of how it works, because your relationships between objects can also have information about, is it required? Is it filtered based on another piece of data or another relationship? Is the pick list from something? So that all can be defined in here. Again, even within all these areas, each one of those has tabs that you can further define and add things into them. So you can add triggers and filters and specific code settings. In this case, this code, there's what's called an edit query, so that your UI components, again, using MVC as an example, they can bind, your UI components can actually bind into your model objects. And then you can have another level of control where you can actually have callbacks from your UI to further define exactly how things happen. Those are called edit queries. And that gives you very lower level control without having to do a lot of work as far as, subclassing something out or creating a whole nother component and stuff like that. So it makes them really flexible. And then it also allows it to be built into your model, so that as you build your model and look at your model, it's nice and organized. It's contained into this core, and then your application, as you're building it and using it, you can see how it all relates together. So it's a lot of the code that you'd have to write. It's pretty much defined in your model, and since it's all defined in a model, our next step is code analysis and then code generation. So within the tool, we're able to go up here and actually build out the application, generate it. And how it does that is it goes through a staging process. It uses what's called templating. And part of the templating is on the last application, the actual setup of how the UI is set up. That's set up as far as the template application, but also the server startup, the server itself, the client application. If there's other applications as far as other servers, remote other systems that tie into it and stuff like that, it can generate all that out. And the base of that template is really like a shell for the whole application to run into. So security and everything, or whatever else you need to add into that. Embedded Jetty is another example. Data source is it supports JDBC, XML, JSON, YAML, over the wire, talking to other systems just based on serializing the objects and stuff like that. So there's lots of different ways that can be managed. So once the application goes through the generation process, it's building out the application, it's generating the source code, and the model's not needed for the running application at all. So what it's able to do is basically allows the developer to kind of focus on what the model is right here, setting all it up, generating the application, and then usually a lot of the time then is to go back and refine it. So you can get very specific about how the UI works, what the setup for the UI looks like. Let's go back to sales order. So you can define the layout for the UI. And what's nice, instead of dragging and dropping your buttons and your text fields and all that stuff, is it's automatically set up. So you just pick what you want, what other objects you want, what properties, what methods and stuff like that. And it's able to know what kind of component to use, but you can fine tune that as much as you want as you go into it. And again, you can use property paths. So sales order, I can automatically, go to the items, go to the vendor, go to specific information, just by following the property paths to that other object. The next part from the generation is the actual code itself, and then building it out. It also builds out your database structures, so your DDL, and then you can also specifically generate the whole application or specific parts to it. But when it generates the application, what it's going to build is it's going to build a basically MVC structure, the project code structured that way, so that we have our DAO level, And then we have a model level. The model's how, all of your like DAO type objects and how their getter setters and everything that matches your model. All of your view, your controller, your controllers basically are all set up to manage startup, manage the application, and then the controllers for UI and for other services and stuff like that. The components themselves are basically, in this case, the application that we're looking at is mostly a desktop application, and we're using Java Swing components. So all those components are basically come with Java. We're able to then create the controllers that allow those UI components to work with the model objects. And so these model objects, there's a base object. The base object is basically set up to be observable, and it's set up so that it fits the MVC. It's the model side of it, again, being the DAO. And then there's a whole side to it that actually lets it automatically work with a data source, which is an ORM for like a relational database. But it allows you to fit in any, in this case we're using JDBC, but if it was any data source, and then within your app, in the app that gets generated for this, because again it's generating almost 100% of this application from queries and everything else, all those queries and everything are able to work across different data sources based on your object model. The web, on the web side, very similar to the UI components that we used in this application, is we have a bunch of UI components, third-party components, component sets from vendors that are set up that can also do the same thing, that can bind with the model objects, just saving lots of time. Very little JavaScript code has to be built within the pages themselves, because it's automatically set up to be included in the pages by the components and stuff. So it saves a lot of time, and it allows you to use a rich component set, but also focus on a high reuse and a high automation, so that you can focus more time on building a better application, more time on increasing the value of the components and stuff that are already there, or bringing on new functionality and stuff that's more specific to the value of your application. So in the next video, what we're going to do is actually look at the code setup. We're kind of going through this pretty fast, but just to give an overview of kind of how it all works together.